I am a descendant of the East State tribe of the Heiltsuk Nation, so I come from the northern part of our territory. And I'm really looking forward to welcoming all of you to Bella Bella and to other parts of our homelands, particularly the southern parts, when you're here very shortly. My academic background is in literature. My practical background is more in community organizing, but most of the work that I do in my home community is focused on the nonprofit sector. I do communications and fundraising for a Heiltsuk nonprofit called Cucks Project Society, which has roots going back to 1999, doing community programming focused on youth engagement and stewardship. And I also serve my nation currently in my second term as an elected tribal councillor. I chair the land stewardship portfolio on behalf of my nation. You can see in this map the red boundary lines around our territory, so it's quite a substantial geographic space that we are managing and protecting. And in addition to my local work, I also represent Heiltsuk at some wider tables like the Board of Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative. So I feel really fortunate that I get to do stewardship work at lots of different levels, starting right from the grassroots of land-based education for young people, through to local and regional political work related to stewardship. It's really exciting to get to do that work at lots of different levels. You're going to hear a lot more from Kelsey in this webinar than you will from me, because by the time you're leaving Bella Bella, you're probably going to be really tired of hearing from me. But I'm really glad to have an opportunity to weigh in on some of the topics we'll be discussing today and to be an ongoing resource to all of you on your journey with this institute.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jess. That leads us into sort of our first portion of today's webinar, which is just to show you guys some of the feedback from your survey. I think sometimes people get surveys and they don't ever think that the presenters actually look at what they submitted, but we did. And you'll see that it's really integrated throughout today's presentation. We took your feedback, which was really thoughtful feedback, and tried to tailor this to really meet your needs for today. And an essence of that is this is a collaborative webinar. As Adam and Dave have mentioned, if you have questions as we're moving along, feel free to enter those into the chat box. We're going to ask you a few questions, so feel free to enter your answers into the chat box, and Adam and Dave will filter those and make sure that we hear them. So to start off, we asked you sort of what was your familiarity with Indigenous history of your home region, and for the most part, you felt much more comfortable with your familiarity around Indigenous history of your home geography, which is great. And hopefully after today, maybe we'll inspire you in different ways to go and learn more. So that for those of you that found yourself sort of in the 3 category, which was kind of like some familiarity, we can get you to a 5, which was extreme familiarity. We also asked you what your familiarity was with Indigenous history of the Great Bear region. And we could see that there was more of a mix here, with a lot of people still feeling like there was a lot left to learn, sort of being in the 1 and 2 category. And so we're hopeful that today we'll start to address some of those questions, that unfamiliarity you might have had or apprehension. And I'm sure as you'll get to travel and learn from Jess and the other Indigenous communities and nations who you'll be visiting during the Institute, that after your experience in September, maybe we can get people to the other range, the other side of the spectrum, towards their level of comfort and familiarity. So to start with that, we have a question for you, and it's how many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are there in Canada? This is a Canada-specific question. And you guys can just kind of throw out numbers into the chat box, and Adam will recount those back to me, because I can't actually see the chat box.
All right, I'm ready for roll in. Someone asked if you're asking for individuals or different bands. or nation?
Yes, so different nations. So not a population count, but how many different distinct nations are there?
Okay, we've got someone saying 600 plus. Someone
Okay.
Someone else thought a high number was 50 to 100, 120,
Okay.
350. We're all over the map. But
Okay, we're all
we are
over the map.
journalists, and numbers are not our first love. So I don't.
Well, for the person I think that might have been first to the draw, 600 plus was actually really close and really accurate. This is a map. Now, maps are very complicated. Cartographic history is very complicated. But for right now, you can kind of get a sense of these are the massive amount of distinct nations across Canada. And we actually start to break that down into numbers. We have 617 different First Nations that have a government-to-government relationship with the state of Canada. That also doesn't include both the Inuit and Métis communities, nations, as they may be represented. When we think about population size in the most recent census, not the one that was just done last year, but these are statistics from the prior one for Canadian Indigenous statistics, we had about 1.9 million people identifying as Aboriginal within the Canadian census. And so when we also start to look at how many First Nations communities there are in Canada, there's a provincial breakdown that you can see on this slide on the right, but it really does start to show you just the breadth of nations, the complexity, and to me, when I see these numbers, it says, look at this amount of potential for stories, for untold histories. And I think that that's a really strong takeaway for today is, if maybe your number was in 50 to 100 and you have to multiply that by 5, you really start to see that there's all of these different untapped areas for resources to learn and to share people's lived experiences that aren't being shared right now. So we're going to do something similar. How many tribal nations do you think there are on the U.S. side of the border? You could do that again of typing into the chat box.
We have 550 plus.
Okay, 550 plus. Yep. Others?
We have 600, 1,500. We're all over.
We're all over. Okay.
200.
So along these lines, well, we'll do that one after. I have one other question, but we'll go to the actual numbers. So here is a map of Indian reservations, territories within the United States. You can zoom in. Google also just had a really good initiative of doing all of the nation territories, actually for both Canada and the United States. So the point of that is that there are, you can't really see some of the other territories, especially on the eastern seaboard side of this map, but it really starts to show you some of the land holdings, massive land holdings, the big green center area in sort of the southwest of the United States is the Navajo Nation with the Hopi Nation inside of that territory. So you can really start to see some of the vast land holdings that tribal nations have in the United States. When we talk about how many nations, in answering the question, it is 567 as of 2017. That is federally recognized tribes. There are probably another 500 or so state recognized and unrecognized tribes in the United States. And so it's just really important to realize, again, that vast potential for partnerships, for relationship building, and for untold stories. And the most recent tribal nation that received federal recognition in that count, because don't trust Wikipedia, I think a lot of people have said 566, but 567 is with the Pamunkey Indian tribe of Virginia. So that's actually one of the original tribes that greeted the Virginia colonists in the 1600s. So when we talk about population size, for American Indians, Alaskan Natives in the United States, this is from 2010 census. It's 5.2 million people that self-identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native. 1.4 million children are Alaskan Native or American Indian. And so that's under the age of 18. And why I share that statistic with you and why it's important both on the Canadian and American side when we're talking about Indigenous peoples is our populations are very young. And so, so we're rapidly growing, and it's really critical to understand that level of rapid growth into the various issues that we face and the protections around environmental resources. So cognizant of time, another activity that we often do is I ask people to see how many nations they can name, individual nations. And so I'd ask maybe for you guys to type into the chat box how many nations of those 567 or 617, so over 1,000, do you think you can name off the top of your head? And you can throw out a number, and it'll just help us as a group to see maybe people's familiarity with Indigenous nations.
We have 20, 25, 35, 50. I think people might be nervous you're going to make them actually say 50. We got 35, well, 35.
I have done that for previous presentations, but no, I won't put that hardship on you guys this time. Okay. But that's really important. When we actually really start to call out the names of nations, sometimes it's really hard for people to get above 20, especially that's even collectively. It's not even at an individual level. Mm-hmm. But why that's important is because, these statistics are great, but we really have to be cognizant of the unique histories and the unique cultures of each of these nations. They're not a monolith. And being able to identify them by name, to know how to properly pronounce each nation's name, is really critical to setting you on that path towards understanding. So a part of that path is to also understand the legal implications of working and building relationships with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations. Firstly, lead with sovereignty, that as Indigenous nations, as First Nations, we have an inherent sovereignty. We have inherent rights that were never lost, never abrogated, and that we're nations, not stakeholders. I think that's a really strong takeaway for today that often gets lost in the sort of political milieu of today's society, is that, Indigenous nations have had such a storied and an ongoing colonial history that people sometimes relegate us to just being, in a public interest group or a stakeholder, and that removes our sovereignty. It removes our autonomy. It removes a lot of the agency that we have in our home territories and across the world and different communities that we live in. So we're nations, not stakeholders. We have our own governments, and in many instances, our own legal systems with varying levels of jurisdiction and collaborative overlapping jurisdictions with both states, provinces, and sort of the federal settler states that we may border. First Nation membership or citizenry is actually a political status. We are citizens of our nation. So there are some racial, ethnic components to Indigenous identity, but there is also a political status. And so being able to understand that complexity will really help you in your relationship building. Additionally, we have a right to self-determination, both under our own laws as well as international law, and that gives us an exclusive jurisdiction and decision-making power over our citizenry. And why that's really important, that right to self-determination, is because it is the foundation of how we articulate our rights to maintain and protect the environment, our territories, resources for future generations. Additionally, within the Canadian context, you're also, you may hear this termed Aboriginal rights. What's really important here is the notion of unceded territory, that there are vast amounts of land across North America that are unceded territory. They are disputed territories. There were never treaties that were made over that territory. And as one elder put it, actually, in a very interesting comment, open forum that he was able to comment at, he said, show me the receipt. And I think sometimes that really gets to the heart of these disputed claims, is that that there is this lost in translation or fallacy, false reality of somewhere there being this receipt for land, receipt for territories that doesn't exist. And so why this is also really important is that in the Canadian context, you have different regions that have numbered treaties, some that are not numbered treaty areas, and especially within the context of First Nation relationships to the province of British Columbia, much of that province is unceded territory, non-treaty territory. And so really starting to unpack that history and unpack that complex jurisdictionality is really important to understanding the communities that you're going to be visiting. So treaty rights and non-abrogated Aboriginal rights, these are terms you may hear. These are the legal recognition of Aboriginal rights to fish and hunt. This has a long-standing history both in the US and in Canada, and that these rights are protected internationally, but also within the Canadian Constitution and other legal instruments and mechanisms. So I have a question now for you. So we're going to go back to the chat box. What do you see on this map? And namely, what I want you to write into the chat box is, what do you not see on this map?
All right. I'm ready. Traditional territories, Indigenous place names. Someone else mentioned traditional territories. And they don't see, boundaries of traditional territories.
Okay, well, you guys got it on the first try. I'm impressed. I like it. So this map, you don't see traditional territories. You don't even see Indigenous place names, as you mentioned. There's really a strong erasure of Indigenous peoples from a place that they've been for thousands and thousands of years, since time immemorial. And that's an injustice. And so when we start to think about, what is the cartographic reality and how does that shape our planning and our conversations around environmental management, that's, really recognizing and having Indigenous nations be on the map is important. So when we turn to actual sources that are created and developed by Indigenous nations themselves, we start to see those nations on the map. And so these are some of the places and communities and nations I believe that you will get to visit with. And here's another example of that. You can sort of see the more regional distinctions, even just within the Great Bear Rainforest. But I'm going to turn it over to Jess to kind of unpack that term as to how did we get the Great Bear Rainforest as a terminology.
Great, thanks. So I'd like to share just a little bit about the nations whose homelands are really on the front lines of the Great Bear Rainforest. Here's yet another map. I was giggling to myself when I looked more closely at Kelsey's first map, just looking at the list of people who contributed data to that map, and it's, government departments and companies that we've been fighting in court over issues in our homelands. So, I'm often asked what I think of the name Great Bear Rainforest. And people are also often surprised to hear that I don't really like it. I understand its utility in terms of branding and marketing. I understand that it's a catchy and positive and evocative name for the region. I also remember a point in my own lifetime when the outside world knew my homeland and the Central Coast more broadly as the Mid-Coast timber supply area. So of course, it's a positive trajectory to get from there to Great Bear Rainforest in a lot of senses. But when those same people ask what I think it should be called instead, well, part of it is Heiltsuk homelands, part of it's Kitasoo-Hehe homelands, part of it's Kit-Kat homelands. Every inch of the Great Bear Rainforest is someone's homeland. Today, I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that our nations typically practice dual governance systems. So we have elected Indian Act band councils who have a sort of political authority that's recognized by the federal government, and that's a seat that I hold in my community as elected tribal councillor. We also have hereditary governance systems that are centered around our chiefs and our matriarchs. Those people in that governance system have a much deeper moral authority. They're the people who hold the rights in our territories and who hold title to our territories. They're the owners and the ultimate stewards of our unceded territories. When I said earlier that our homelands are at the front lines of the Great Bear Rainforest, I meant it. These are front lands. The idea of the Great Bear Rainforest is in a lot of senses a political construct that's responding to pressures and conflicts that are associated with resource extraction on the coast. And you see that in maps of the Great Bear Rainforest, where the people who are contributing the information are extractive industry and levels of government who are approving that extractive industry. A lot of times the information that's being presented to the wider world isn't coming from those rights holders, those title holders, those nations who live there on the front lines. But when it comes to the monitoring of the implementation of sustainable forestry practices, or cleaning up the aftermath of a spill, or when the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have left the Great Bear Rainforest and gone back to the UK, and this region is no longer in the limelight, it's those chiefs and those matriarchs and our people in our communities who are still here on the front lines, who are still dealing with the everyday reality of the pressures and conflicts that are created by the outside world coming into our homelands. Our identity is inseparable from this place. We're inheritors of a legacy of tens of thousands of years of our ancestors caring for it. So one thing that I think is really important to understand when you're thinking about the idea of the Great Bear Rainforest and the Great Bear Institute and coming here to this place that the outside world knows as the Great Bear Rainforest, just know that it has other names. It has other names at other scales that have really deep histories. When you're walking the shorelines here, when you're walking in the watersheds, you're going to be experiencing something that's a lot richer and deeper and older than the concept of the Great Bear Rainforest could ever convey. And I hope that that's a sense of power and history that you get to really connect with when you're here, because I think it's a really important context for understanding the Indigenous communities that you will interact with, both as participants in this institute and as journalists who may have an interest in this place in the long term.
Well, thank you, Jess. Wow, definitely, I couldn't have said that better. And I know that the next slide we had was for you to talk more about who they're, what they might see, any sort of interesting issues that have been sort of really related to the media, some things that you've experienced that you'd want to share from your perspective. But I'm also, if that.
I guess what I would maybe add is that I think we're going to have opportunities, or at least I've been trying to create opportunities for all of you to go deeper on a lot of those more detailed conversations when you're here. I'm really hopeful that you'll be able to spend some time with some of those chiefs and elders and matriarchs, people from tribal council, people from our stewardship office, the people who live the reality of being here in our territory and who have been the faces to the wider world on issues like the Nathan E. Stewart grounding, the Enbridge pipeline conflict, the commercial herring dispute, all of those instances where Heiltsuk in particular have become of interest to the wider world. So I don't want to go into too much detail about those things here, but just know that there is a really powerful community of storytellers and spokespersons here, and I'm really hopeful that you'll get to meet and interact with lots of them in deep, meaningful ways while you're on the ground.
Thank you. And can you share? I just flipped to the image you shared of the community, and I didn't know if you wanted to just describe it more for the participants.
Yeah, I need to get better at labeling my files because I'm trying to remember what thing we were marching about in this picture. There are just so many beautiful pictures of instances where the community has kind of really risen up in visible, powerful displays of sovereignty and care for homelands. But the people that you see here, some of them might be the faces that you see in newscasts or the people you see quoted in articles. A lot of them are not. But from a community perspective, I think the important thing to remember is that all of those voices are valued equally here on the ground, even though not all of us are the ones who are out speaking in the wider world. But there's a really deep sense of community and collective voice, so that, you know, when I'm speaking to you at this webinar, or when I'm giving an interview, or when I'm giving a talk, it's all of these people and more than are pictured speaking through me.
Fantastic. Well, and I think that's a really great transition to the next section of the presentation. And you're going to be talking a little bit more too about how you really do go about building those relationships, and some of the sort of cultural hiccups or cultural bumps to watch out for. And with that, to be able to build these types of relationships as with Indigenous people, with Indigenous nations and our communities, as journalists, and sort of wearing that journalist hat, you have to recognize that we have an immense amount of historical trauma in our communities, and historical trauma that is often grounded in environmental violence. And what one elder said to me is that, you know, one act of violence takes 4 generations to heal. And why that is so powerful is that as Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples, if we consistently have to deal with acts of violence against our homelands, against our territories, against our relations, whether that be water or air or our land, we can never take the time to properly heal. And so as journalists coming into Indigenous nations and communities, to be cognizant of that, to be cognizant that the people you're talking to, the communities you're talking to, have a level of historical trauma that they're carrying with them is really important. And it'll help you in being able to build relationships. And one of the, you know, at least within the Canadian context, one of the sort of new aspirations, recent aspirations, is reconciliation. And with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and Commission's report coming out in the past few years, what does that mean for the media? What role should the media have? And generally to understand that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of such a horrific and violent history of residential schooling within Canada, but that those types of residential schooling experiences and institutions also existed in the United States, and also had that strong legacy of violence and trauma. So it's often very much a shared experience of Indigenous peoples, not only within North America, but around the world elsewhere, where similar types of total institutionalism and violent institutionalism happened to Indigenous children. So having an understanding of what role the media can play when we start to think about, you know, boiled water advisories within, you know, across Canada, and the level of resonance that has with popular society today. I also, you know, draw your attention to the photo here, which is a famous photo of the chairman of the Mandan-Arthur and Heiltsuk nations crying at the signing of the Garrison Dam. Because that dam, which is a part of the Pick Sloan program in the 40s for the United States government, took the traditional territory, sacred territory for those 3 affiliated tribes, and flooded it for hydropower. And I share this image because I see this image coming back, you know, decade after decade, and even now. Even having resonance with what's happening with the proliferation of the Site C hydropower in the northern part of British Columbia and the Indigenous nations that's impacting, and even some of the pipeline projects that Jess mentioned. These are all instances of societal environmental violence against Indigenous nations and homelands that have a real impact on how we start to interact with the world, but also interact with the media, and that maybe it doesn't have to come just from Indigenous people, but that the media can have a role in helping us with that healing process through reconciliation. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually issued in their report calls to action. 3 of those calls to action specifically are related to the role of the media in promoting reconciliation and in helping with reconciliation. And those are call to action 84, 85, and 86. I've actually pulled out the content of them. And it really, it's about increasing Aboriginal programming, including Aboriginal language speakers, equitable access. We're really talking about equity, and continuing to provide dedicated news coverage across a range of issues that are of concern to Indigenous peoples. And I think that's a really resonating recommendation. For 85, it says continue to provide leadership in programming and organizational culture that reflects the diversity of Indigenous peoples. That this is not a monolith, that these are distinct nations with unique histories and cultures. And to develop media initiatives that inform and educate the Canadian public. And in a lot of ways, the Institute is one example of that. For 86, it says that we call upon Canadian journalism programs and media schools to require education for all students on the history of Aboriginal peoples, and to also be familiar with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how that enshrines within international customary law certain rights and to Indigenous nations and peoples that journalists should work to protect and to advocate for. And so if you've never heard of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I wanted to orient you to it. It's freely downloadable online. I will have a resource link available to you. In passing, it's often referred to as UNDRIP. You may even hear community members reference it. But specific to UNDRIP is Article 16, which talks about the right that Indigenous peoples have to establish our own media in our own languages and to have access to all forms of non-Indigenous media without discrimination. And I think that that's really critical to the work that you do and to finding ways to enshrine the articles of UNDRIP into your everyday work. And it also mentions that states shall take the effective measures to ensure that state-owned media duly reflect Indigenous cultural diversity. Again, for so long, the media have portrayed Indigenous people as monolithic, and we have a right to challenge that. We have a right to have our cultural diversity reflected in the media. The other part of UNDRIP, especially as it pertains to environmental concerns, as I mentioned earlier, is Article 3, which says that we have the right to self-determination over our lands and territories. And a big part of UNDRIP and the rights that it stipulates is free, prior, and informed consent. That's actually within Article 32. And why I give you this infographic, this visual of free, prior, and informed consent, is because this is one of the most contested articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially by the state of Canada and the United States. They both do not believe that Indigenous nations or peoples have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. They have articulated that Indigenous peoples and nations have the right to meaningful consultation. And so what that means is that they sort of get to that they recognize the right to self-determination or right to participation. They do some type of consultation that they vaguely don't really have standardized across all of their interactions with Indigenous nations, or try and review for best practices, but they fail to actually obtain the free, prior, and informed consent. And in some instances they may. But for meaningful consultation, it's those first 3 portions, sometimes only those first 2, and it fails to get to the second half. And and if you're familiar with legal mechanisms, with international law, you can't just pick and choose what parts of a legal principle you want to apply. And so that's really one of the great challenges that Indigenous peoples and nations face in protecting our territories and environmental resources. Is really trying to push forward an understanding and a protection of the right to free, prior, and informed consent.
Hey,
So,
Kelsey.
Yes, you have a question.
Yes, I do have a question. One just came in about audiences we should address in our stories. They ask, for readers who aren't familiar with Indigenous history and trauma, how much context do you think we should provide on the past, especially if their stories looking at current events?
Well, I think that's a really great question, and I think it's going to depend on the specific topic. What I'm sensing there, and what you'll see from some of the other recommendations we have about how to build your stories later in the session, is think about variety, and also think about if there's ways for you to have a follow-up story, for you to build, for your first story to potentially introduce some of the history, to orient people to the homeland, to the community, to the nation or nations that you're looking at, and the issues that are of importance to them, and then to slowly build out from there in future follow-up, in almost a series. We've seen those to be really successful. But when we talk about sort of the historical trauma component, it's more about how do you go into communities and be respectful of that, to build relationships so that you're not helicoptering in and just taking without realizing that that could be more contributory to someone's trauma than you might think. Jess, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I mean, I would just reiterate that sometimes it's less about the details that you put in the piece that you're writing and more about the way that you conduct yourself in community and the way that you choose to frame and to write what you're working on.
And if we didn't exactly answer it, feel free to rephrase, or maybe there's a sub question to that you want us to answer. We'll be happy to have Adam tell us again. But this might help. So there was a recent study done about how the media portrays Indigenous drinking water issues, and it was a systematic analysis of newspaper coverage, Canadian newspaper coverage from 2000 and 2015. And it's a really great article. It's open access, so definitely take an opportunity to download it after the webinar. But what they found is that a lot of the articles focus on government responses. So how is the province of Ontario responding to Indigenous water drinking issues? How is the province of British Columbia? How is the local municipality of the city of Toronto responding? But so few of them, less than 20, actually center their article from the perspective of Indigenous governance. How are Indigenous peoples governing and working towards addressing drinking water issues? And to me, that is really at the heart of how we need to shift our journalism and how we need to shift the way in which Indigenous peoples are represented in the media. There needs to be greater balance, and we'll talk about that. So one of the great resources that I can share with you is reporting in Indigenous communities. You can see there it's riic.ca. This is a website online toolkit put together by Duncan McHugh. He is just a fabulous Indigenous journalist, scholar, advocate, and he's put together this online toolkit that kind of goes through all of the questions you could have about working with Indigenous nations and Indigenous communities and people, and there's different case studies that you can work through, role-playing instances, and it's continually being updated and evolving. And so this is sort of one of the best resources I can give you, even internationally, for working with Indigenous communities. But there's also, when you kind of have to orient yourself to that sort of introductory level, those foundational concepts, which you can find on that Reporting in Indigenous Community site. But then once you sort of have that foundational knowledge, you need to understand the local protocol, cultural protocol for the communities and nations you're going to be working with or visiting with. So I wanted to turn it over to Jess to talk a little bit about for her nation, what that's going to look like, and when you guys are visiting, things that you should be cautious of.
Yeah, thanks. So I would just like to share a little bit about sort of historical context and more recent protocols around media relations here in Bella Bella. You know, of course, recognizing that other nations that you might visit might not necessarily have the same systems and protocols in place. But Heiltsuk have a long history of drawing attention to ourselves. We're really passionate advocates, as I'm sure you'll find most Indigenous peoples are, for social and environmental welfare in our homelands. For us, whether it's major historical landmark court cases like the Gladstone decision, or our history of protest around issues like fish farms and clear-cut logging and commercial kill fisheries, or our stance on trophy hunting, or big recent events like the Nathan E. Stewart fuel barge that sank last fall, there have been many occasions over many decades where we have found that we are the subject of attention from the outside world. Whether it's been anthropologists, authors, journalists, filmmakers, we've had armies of people over the years who wanted to tell our story or parts of our story in that wider world. And that's often happened with very little accountability back to the community and very little community control over what happens once the interview is concluded. And not so much in very recent history, but certainly in the past, there's kind of a long stinging history of really low ethical standards governing a lot of the people who have come in to do work in our territory in that kind of context. So one of the things that we've done here in Bella Bella is that we have put a protocol system in place. So if someone wants to do work in our territory, it's going to be vetted by the nation if you expect community representatives to participate in what you're doing. That doesn't just go for pieces of writing. It goes for any kind of research, any kind of commercial activity, anything that anyone from outside wants to do in our territory. This is organized through research liaisons who are based in our stewardship office, and they are the first point of contact for people from the wider world who want to come in and do work here. So if you're writing a book, or you're making a film, or you're proposing a research project, we expect to hear about it. That may sound really heavy-handed, but it's our experience that the accountability that comes through really early collaboration is worth investing in. And for those who try to circumvent those protocols, you'll find you hit a lot of brick walls in the community because community members won't talk to you and won't invest in what you're doing until they have assurance that you have followed the protocols the nation's put in place. So when you pitch your project, we're going to ask a lot of questions about why you're doing it and who benefits. We're going to have feedback for you on how you can meaningfully and appropriately engage the nation and its community members. We have a really strong interest in making sure that our sacred stories and ceremonies and cultural aspects are protected, that our community members are shielded from being re-traumatized in the context of certain projects. We're going to raise any red flags that we see around potential impacts or profits or misrepresentations associated with what you want to do. And when we feel like we're on the same page with you, we're going to have lots of help that we can offer in terms of making sure that you're connected to the right people, that you have the logistical help that you need to make your project a success. And we're going to stay engaged until it's done and we can evaluate how well it went. That's a really big process and it often takes a lot of time. We recognize that in the case of journalists, sometimes that process is too slow to dovetail with the kind of deadlines and the reporting on live issues that you're doing. And so, we don't always go through that level of depth in terms of the protocol, but that's where the kind of trust building with individual journalists will go a really long way. I know we're going to talk more about that later in the webinar with some other slides that Kelsey has to share. But what I think it's really important to know is that even when it comes to those live issues, we still have our own internal accountability measures in place to make sure that our communications are centralized, that appropriate liaisons at the nation are tracking interviews and the resulting articles, that we have a line of communication to ensure accuracy in those things that have come out, and that journalists are connected to appropriate spokespersons within the community. And I think we've seen recently, particularly when it comes to coverage of some recent archaeological finds, that system of engaging in a different way with journalists, I think, has paid off on both sides. I think there's been really great mutual benefits. So, I think about coverage in the media many years ago of some quote unquote scientific discoveries around wolves on the Central Coast. There were all of these headlines and all of these articles announcing that scientists had discovered that wolves on the Central Coast ate salmon, and it was this groundbreaking discovery. And people in the community saw these headlines and these articles coming out and said to themselves, well, how is that a discovery? We've always known that. We told them that. That wasn't even part of the research they had planned until we told them to look for it. There was all of this deep community knowledge around that somehow appears not to be valid until Western science comes in and discovers it. And a lot of the news coverage of that discovery at that time was full of language that was really dismissive of our internal systems of keeping and sharing knowledge and the way that we interact with our territory and people who work here. It was really problematic and difficult for the community to process because it felt like a devaluing of that knowledge that was a violation of the trust that people felt they had between themselves and the scientists who were doing that research. It was really unfortunate. It's taken a long time to recover from in terms of our relationships with those scientists. But if you think more recently, I mean, a lot of you probably seen coverage around the recent archaeological finds at Trickett Island that dated some objects back 14,000 years and affirmed Heiltsuk oral history around our presence in certain parts of our homeland's geography before and during the Ice Age. Now, the coverage of that wasn't perfect, but when that information about that archaeological dig was released, there was a lot of collaboration between the scientists and our stewardship office to talk about messaging. And community members who were participating in interviews related to that archaeological dig were really prepared with their messaging. They worked really hard to hold those journalists accountable for accurate and sensitive language in their articles. And so when you saw pieces emerging from that story, there was a lot of really strong language around that archaeological find affirming Heiltsuk oral history. There were still some places that framed it as a discovery and made people in the community roll their eyes a little bit, because how can you discover something and we've always known where it was? But when you put that work in, and when you try to build relationships with the journalists who are coming and wanting to share those stories, when you have people who are doing the work on the community side to ensure that we are advocating for stories to be told in sensitive and authentic and accurate ways, I think the results that you see are much more beautiful and rich stories that are much more evocative. Maybe I'm a little biased on that point, but I think it's a system that we're seeing working really well in Bella Bella, having more of a hand in how those stories evolve right from the beginning. The fact is that we have a lot at stake in terms of how we're represented in the wider world. Our social capital and our power to negotiate, our ability to fundraise for some of the work we want to do, our relationships with neighboring nations and partners, the whole perception of us as Heiltsuk people by the wider world, all of that is really clearly influenced by the way that we're portrayed in the media. We, as you've heard from Kelsey, deal with racism and systemic barriers even without reinforcement of those negative representations in the media. We can't afford to be passive when it comes to our interactions with the people who are carrying those stories out into the wider world. And let's be honest, in the instances where I've been quoted out of context or misunderstood by journalists, my community is watching, and oh boy, do I catch hell for every bad interview. So just know that when you're going into that kind of community context to do reporting, that accountability and trust are a huge component of your conversations, and your interviewees are likely highly motivated to ensure that whatever protocols are in place in that community are followed to a T. I know that can be daunting, and I know it's not quick, and I know that your footing isn't always sure, and I know it can feel like there's a huge disconnect between the sort of generational timescales that are present in my mind versus the kind of timescales that you're operating on with your deadlines. And there's more slides to come with more details on outreach processes, and a lot of these concerns and personal experiences also emerged from your survey feedback, so I know it's something that's present in your minds. But here's my takeaway message, here's my pitch. The learning that you do in those interactions and the relationships that you build are really worth investing in. On the community side, we don't expect you to show up perfect, but it goes a long way when you show up humble so that we can grow together. And you should never underestimate the ripples of your effort. I can tell you there's a list on my wall that I'm looking at right now of journalists that I won't talk to based on my negative history with them or cautions from people that I trust. There's also a list of journalists in my head whose calls I will always answer and with whom I will always be incredibly candid because I know they have integrity. And I also get calls and emails every week, sometimes every day, from relatives from other nations saying, hey, so-and-so just asked me for an interview, what do you think? Now, I don't want to sound like Big Brother, but I've even made recommendations to relatives from other nations about how they should answer interview requests from journalists who are on this webinar right now. And don't worry, it was positive. But just to say that we're talking to each other. This is not always just a one-to-one relationship, even though sometimes it may feel like that's what you're developing. But I really encourage you to think of the relationships that you're investing in, not just as one-to-one trust building, but as opportunities to really reiterate to that corner of Indian country through the conduit of the person that you're talking to that you are a storyteller with integrity. And I will hand it over to Kelsey to talk about some processes for how that can happen.
Well, thank you, Jess. That was fantastic, and really, that was a great segue into sort of this last portion of the webinar, which hopefully is just to give you some strong recommendation, takeaways, lessons learned of really how to do this relationship building.
And
so there's some stages. Yes, is there a question?
Yes, and this may not be a great segue. And first, I would say that everyone listening right now, do not end up on Jess's list. IJNR is counting on you to be on the good list. Secondly, the question is that someone is fairly familiar with the histories, policies, and laws underlying stories about Native American and Alaska Native tribes, but they're far less so when it comes to Canada's First Nations. So could either of you recommend a book or a documentary that they could check out before to get up to speed before our institute starts?
The one that I always really love to recommend, and I'll type it into the chat box too, just so everybody knows, is Indigenous Rights, A Guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Issues in Canada by Chelsea Vowell. It is a phenomenal resource.
Yes, I would agree with Jess's recommendation, and then anything by Glenn Coulthard as well. I can't type that in, but Jess, if you want to write his name in, I think that would also be a strong recommendation for Indigenous rights on the northern side of the border. Yeah. And as we think of more, we can try and type them into the chat box or send in a follow-up email to you guys. That was a really great question. So I'm sure you're going to have more questions about how to do outreach around research and interviewing and how do you put your story together. And really where a lot of that stems from is getting that first initial contact and reaching out. So we asked you what your personal experience was with reporting on Indigenous issues. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a collaborative webinar. So I thought it was important to share some of your responses anonymously, of course. But you're probably going to resonate with some of what your peers have written. So firstly, Someone wrote that I've mainly reported on Indigenous cultures through archaeological news. When a significant artifact is found or a scientific study has been released. I try to be cognizant of current issues surrounding ownership or reclamation of cultural artifacts and report on relevant debates or legal concerns. Someone else wrote that they report on Indigenous issues fairly often, try and spend time studying best practices and thinking about how to be respectful, non-patriarchal, in reporting on a culture that isn't their own. And what's really interesting here is that they really try and allow for Indigenous people to speak for themselves, and avoiding cliches, as hard as that might be. That's a really key point. Reporting on traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, and fire management in Australia and the US, drawing those comparisons, those corollaries, and then reporting on and editing Indigenous protests against Dakota Access Pipeline. Someone else also referenced that they have worked with different nations and communities, edited numerous articles, and they always try and have someone look over their pieces. And then someone else said, in the US, tribes are understandably cautious and it can take longer to build trust. An introduction by someone they know and trust helps. And I think what Jess said earlier really reiterates this, right? It's sometimes it's really helpful if you have a conduit, someone who can really introduce you to people, but who also can vouch for you. So some key principles to keep in mind when you're working with Indigenous peoples: respect. It's a principle that we really value in our communities and among our nations. So understanding that Indigenous control is really important in the development of the story, not just in the final product, because that control has been denied to us for so many centuries because of colonialism. So Indigenous control over a piece is also about enshrining UNDRIP, valuing self-determination, not just in the broad sense of self-determination, but even in the way that we're portrayed in the media. Consultation, communication, and consent, allowing for authenticity, making sure that that there are specific security protocols in place, confidentiality protocols in place, especially if you're dealing with things that are of a sacred nature. Attribution, Jess mentioned how, if that something was only discovered because Western science was able to label it as such, but really attributing where you're getting your sources from, where this knowledge is coming from, giving credit to where credit is due, and understanding that that there is a rich knowledge in Indigenous nations. There's rich Indigenous science, and that's a science that's an applied science over thousands of years. And so attributing that is critical to how the world starts and continues to understand our nations. Continuing cultures, not a monolith, sharing of benefits, and recognition and protection under the law. So making sure that you're not doing anything that really is in violation of outstanding domestic and international legal principles. So when we think about Indigenous people in the media, we know that there's disproportionate media coverage of Indigenous nations, and we're not covering enough of our unique stories or our complicated histories. We also recognize that there's this lack of reporting can render Indigenous peoples invisible or as marginalized actors, when oftentimes we're doing really amazing things to protect against climate change and environmental mismanagement. So how do you go about decolonizing your journalism? Well, one of the first things is to recognize maybe problems with your sources. The information source referenced in an article is an important indicator for Indigenous people of the level of complexity that you use as a journalist to frame Indigenous issues. And we feel that representative media coverage will use sources that have the permission to speak on behalf of an Indigenous nation or community. So you have to be really careful that the person you're talking to actually has the permission and the right to represent the nation. And if they don't, then you need to, appropriately attribute their statements to their individual person and not to the whole community or the whole nation. So, all of this is that Indigenous, saying basically that Indigenous resilience is complex. There's often a tendency in the media to generalize our issues, And that lack of complexity is a major red flag for Indigenous readers and for Indigenous nations as to the efficacy of a journalist.
Hey, Kelsey, real quick.
Yes.
How do you find the people who have permission to speak on behalf of the community?
Yes. So there are some examples where Indigenous nations will actually have a communications person, someone who is delegated with speaking to the press, or who is at least someone who can determine who's the right tribal or Indigenous representative for you to speak with on behalf of the nation. It's also about having done your footwork to build the relationships in the community so that traditional knowledge holders, elders are telling you, and you're getting a consistent feedback of who is the appropriate person to speak to. Jess, do you have thoughts on that, or did I cover it?
Yeah, I would just add that, it's going to vary a little bit from place to place. And I know one of the things that often happens is, there are lots of journalists who have my phone number because of interviews done on one issue at one point. And often when they're covering a totally different story at another time, they'll call me because they have my number, regardless of whether it's an issue that I can speak to. And part of that trust building relationship is having trust that the person you're talking to in the community will know when they're not the right spokesperson, and help you find the right people. And so in Bella Bella and at Heiltsuk, we've worked really hard to have internal accountability mechanisms in place so that we're ensuring that we're putting the right voices forward. But sometimes it's not really cut and dry, and sometimes it's about making the effort to seek that guidance from a governing body or a communications manager for the nation. Sometimes it's about speaking to more than one person and hearing patterns of consistency in the advice about who to speak to. But it's a lot of due diligence to do. I recognize that.
And we have a recommendation later, but I'll say it now because I feel like it fits with this question. In that relationship building, sometimes it's also about setting up spaces for journalists to meet with community members. And that's really sort of the first step in identifying all of the different roles individuals may hold within a community. So starting to get to know nations and the people within those nations before you write your story is going to be really helpful in contributing something meaningful and building that trust, as this slide says. So our communities are interconnected. We listen to each other's advice about who is trustworthy, and I think Jess's story she shared earlier is a prime example of that. So when we talk about, how do you go about, building these relationships, recognize that there are Indigenous experts in every field with many years of professional and lived experience. And so it's the responsibility of well-informed journalists to go out and find that most appropriate spokesperson. And so be really specific with your questions, with who you're looking for. Because I think the most frustrating call or email a communications director for a nation, or just a tribal or Indigenous leader for a nation can get is, I want to talk to someone about, this pipeline, or, this species of that's of interest to my story, or about this piece of legislation that's being passed. And they're like, someone? Okay, can you be more specific with who that person might look like, or what type of questions you might have for the person? So specificity is really going to help you in trying to find the right person. When possible, we recommend doubling, maybe that might even be tripling or quadrupling your research time for a story on Indigenous experiences, again, because there are often going to be different temporal scales that we will talk about. But as you start to build these stronger relationships with Indigenous people, it's going to become easier. I know it seems really daunting and difficult right now because you're probably just, for some of you, just on the start of this type of journey of working with Indigenous nations. But see this as really a journey, not a checklist, and it's not something you can just do on a one-off for one story. It's really about building relationships that really will last you the lifetime of your career. And oftentimes you're going to build relationships that inspire you just even beyond your daily workload and beyond journalism. They'll really inspire a lot of your just your lived experience. So I want to turn it over back to Jess to talk a little bit about gatekeepers.
So we have talked a lot about the kind of context of colonial history and trauma that can and should be informing your work in a community context, but there's another kind of piece of history and context that I just want to quickly draw attention to, which is around the sort of perceived power dynamics around who's telling stories and who's the gatekeeper for stories. It is just a fact that there is a long history of exploitation and misrepresentation, and of media and storytelling really functioning as an extractive industry in which benefits are derived at the expense of communities and individuals. There is an attitude that many of us have often encountered, that journalism as an institution is independent and untouchable and unbiased, and that you can't compromise to any community requests or feedback. And frankly, we often encounter the attitude that communities should just be grateful that you're deigning to cover their story. But it's important to remember that systems of knowledge keeping and storytelling are not always universal, that we have our own internal systems of keeping and passing down knowledge, that knowledge is sacred, that we have our own concepts of intellectual property, that stories are sacred, that frankly our stories are the whole root of our culture and identity. They're everything that we have at stake. And when you're asking people to share those stories with you, and for you to be able to take pieces of them and share them with the wider world, it's not just about the facts of a narrative. It is very much about the kind of trust that's at the root of our identity. And so, when we're talking about the legacies that you're walking into in your community relationships, just know that there is also a journalistic legacy of people coming in and instigating very negative relationships based on the idea that the audience that they can bring your story to is a thing that gives them power over you as a community spokesperson. And that is a big, difficult legacy that you are inheriting as progressive and collaborative journalists who are coming into community. And so being able to acknowledge that that's there and be frank that you're different, I think is a really important part of helping to kind of hit the reset button and build those relationships on a really good tone.
Well, and along those lines, people, like Indigenous people that you may be contacting, may seem a little distant or cold at first. But I mean, I don't know, I think maybe there's a false expectation there that everyone should be so like friendly and welcoming. But what I guess the point in saying that is cold and distant is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that as Indigenous people, we're sometimes cautious because of this legacy of violence and exploitation that journalists have been, very much a part of. Whether it's, the example here with, the publishing of flyers and awards for hunting Indian scalps, or if it's something like the vanishing race, or how many articles were published that, this is the last Indian over the past century. And sadly, there are still even some contemporary journalists and articles that are being published of that same vein. And so just be persistent and jovial and humble, and don't necessarily think that a distant, maybe cold initial reaction is a bad reaction. It's more just a sometimes often a symbol of caution, as people try and determine whether you're, unfortunately for that dichotomy, a good guy or a bad guy, or good person, bad person. So some takeaway things that we have here is about creating balance. It's important to report on inequalities. We know that, but we want you to be mindful if the only thing that you're contributing is a disproportionate number of negative stories about Indigenous peoples, then our communities are going to put you sort of on that list of maybe people that we shouldn't talk to. Think about ways of balancing the stories that you're writing, so that yes, if that's what's happening, if there's an inequality, if there's a negative thing, sure, it's important to report on it, but balance that with also a positive story, with some of the great Indigenous-led initiatives that are happening in our nations and in our communities. Stories of hope and healing and survival are really important, and it's a way for you to be a part of that healing process, of all the violence that's been inflicted. Is balancing the types of stories that are promulgated and proliferated is a part of reconciliation. We also want you to be cautious of your comment sections. We're not going to tell you what to or to not do, but we want you to be mindful that oftentimes there can be a lot of online violence and bullying that happens in the comment sections of stories on Indigenous peoples or on Indigenous issues. And then, there's been a great article that was put out about uncivil dialogue related to this, and there are other articles that you could find. But it might be a conversation to have. I mean, have you ever explored whether or not your comment section has been one of the ones that's been riddled with really, negative, racist comments around Indigenous people? Because you could even put out a really good story, and then the comment section could totally explode with lots of racism, and that could completely cripple your relationship with an Indigenous community, because they go on to read your fantastic, positive story, and the comments are riddled with racism.
Hey,
so research is about, yes, we have a question.
And I know this came up, I'm echoing. Someone's asking there's institutional rules in journalism, in magazines and newspapers, against allowing full review of stories by sources. And they're wondering if you have any recommendations for how someone could navigate this nexus of the journalistic standards of conduct and the collaborative approach that you've been suggesting. And I know we ran into this during our Drinking Water Institute as well.
Yeah. The shortest answer I can say is push back. Really start to use, as I mentioned, you can lead with UNDRIP. You can say, journalism and the principles of journalism may need to evolve when it comes to working with Indigenous communities, based on the historical trauma and violence our profession has actually committed against these populations. And I don't think that type of reconciliation really has happened. I think we're getting there, but it's going to take journalists pushing back and maybe doing something that maybe your editor wouldn't necessarily approve, but to show that once you've done it, you come out with a really great article that's so well received by so many diverse audiences. And I guess that's the short of my answer is that it is complicated, and it's going to be different for each journalist and for each journalistic institution as to how best to approach that. But I think it needs to come internally, and I think it's just personal reflection on how can we really start to have the institution think really hard about how it could do better to work with Indigenous people. Jess, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, if I could just add 3 quick and I think pretty concrete things. One is that I'm really big on social media credit checks when it comes to journalists that I don't know. So the way that you're framing the pieces that you share, the kind of public presence that you have in terms of your social media streams, we can read a lot between the lines from that, and also in the pieces that you have published and shared that tell us a lot about how nuanced and sensitive your writing is. So I think being very public with that and sharing a lot is helpful, because that gives us a lot that we can interpret in terms of I guess the level of trust that we're likely to have. And then 2 other quick things that I think are where a lot of the friction has often existed for me. One is just there's a lot of friction in terms of accuracy. I don't necessarily need to review a draft of your article, but I do need to know that you have invested time in your fact checking and in the accuracy of spelling and details, that you're attributing things to the right people, that you have people's job titles correctly. Like, a lot of that side of things is often quite sloppy, to be honest, in a lot of mainstream media coverage of community issues that I've experienced. And so a lot of the frustration comes from just small inaccuracies that you can address ahead of time, I think. And the last piece is that if you're not writing your own headlines, I think it's important to reinforce that in a lot of ways your reputation lives and dies in terms of your community relationships, based on how well the headline matches what you've written. Because I've seen a lot of pieces come out that are really balanced, important, rich, nuanced pieces of writing that have crazy, sensational headlines that end up being all that people read. That's the only take-home message that a lot of the audience really internalizes. That's really what's driving a lot of the comment section. And when there's a really big disparity between the headline and the story, if that is a place where you can exercise control within your own institution and journalistic standards, I think that's another piece where you could probably circumvent a lot of frustration from community partners.
So Jess, if you could see every single person listening to this webinar right now, you would see them nodding enthusiastically about that. Journalists hate the headlines that are often attached to their stories. So I think that's an interesting point to bring up. We also had a question from another person listening in here, wondering if you guys have heard of sensitivity readers. It's writers are often now using people, often freelance people, to look for possible issues or red flags in their stories, especially when they're talking about underrepresented groups. And I'm wondering if you've heard of that or what you think of it. And if I totally butchered your question, Gloria, unmute yourself and clarify.
Yeah. So firstly, and then I'll let Jess add in if she's also yes. So definitely heard of sensitivity readers, and I think it's just going to again be on a case by case basis, because at a first level, yes, it's great to have someone review it who's connected and close to the culture that you're writing about and the nation that you're writing about. But I often think that the sensitivity readers, they might just take like any person that identifies as Indigenous and are like, oh, you're Indigenous from South America, you should be the sensitivity reader for the Heiltsuk Nation. And that's not going to do it for you either. So I think it has to be, it's one step, but it's not the be all end all step, because I still think, like Jess mentioned, and I want to echo that too, that it's not that we need to fully read all of your articles, but we often most see the misquoting. So not what you're actually attributing to our specific voices when interviewing us, as you know, as happening quite frequently, misquoting, and then also misspellings and not giving people titles that they don't actually have. Like, I've had a few people from my nation that were listed as chief of the nation, and we don't actually have a chief in our governance system. So it's things like that where you're just like, did you know, I mean, you can even see on Wikipedia that's not in our governance system. So it's like, how much, you know, how much research are you actually doing? So yes, I think sensitivity readers are not a bad thing, but I think you could still set yourself up for problems if you're not actually working with the community. Jess?
Yeah, I would think that sensitivity readers are a substitute for good community relationships, but I will share that it's something that I have done in the context more of academic articles and papers. And to Kelsey's point around finding someone who has reasonably local knowledge. One of the ways that people have sometimes found me to do that kind of work is through regional organizations. So through reaching out to the communications manager at a place like Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative and saying, you know, I'm working on this piece that is concerned with this region. Is there someone who's close enough to it that they can give me an accurate read, but distant enough from it that it's not, you know, they're not too close? Is there someone you can recommend who can do that work? And so it may be that more regional organizations are a good path to finding the right people.
So,
Okay. Yeah.
Is
there another question?
There is another question, but we're also running up against some
time
here. So I will save the question for later if you want to wrap up with these last couple slides.
That sounds perfect. So, and maybe the question might get answered in the last couple slides. So, lastly, you may often term the sourcing for your story as research, but we wanted to try and encourage you to think about it as relationship building. That you need to take the time to build these strong relationships. I know that you're going to have deadlines looming, but if you have these relationships formed in advance, it's going to just make it so much easier to navigate Indigenous communities when the time comes. Start locally. You can expand, and when we encourage you to expand as, you know, to your heart's content. But I think it's really important to orient yourself to the current local nations that are around you and within your home geography. If you're metropolitan based, that doesn't mean you don't have an Indigenous community that is around you. You can build relationships with urban Indian centers or friendship centers, community representatives. And oftentimes, a lot of metropolitan areas are actually on unceded territory, disputed territories of Indigenous nations that were forcibly removed. So, you know, orienting yourself to that history is really important as well. Consider organizing meet and greets, as I mentioned earlier. Remember that building trust takes time. Back to your deadlines. It can be challenging to meet tight deadlines without relationships already established. And it's really important that you articulate the deadline you are working with to the Indigenous representatives that you are conducting outreach to. They are likely going to be incredibly busy, so the more specific you can be about the deadline you're trying to meet and the expectations you have, the better and the more smoothly your interaction is going to be. You know, oftentimes Indigenous people, you know, we say this even within our own communities. Oh, we're on Indian time, and yes, some of our communities do go at a slower pace. We have different notions of time, but sometimes the lateness or the miscommunication around time is because journalists aren't specific from the outset of the deadlines that you're working with. You also have to respect the processes your source may need to go through to secure permissions to speak on behalf of whoever you're asking them to speak on behalf of. And so just have an open conversation about what those cultural protocols may be. Finding spokespeople, be careful. We've mentioned this a few times already. We have a list of people we trust and don't trust. Ask your source if they are speaking as an individual or as a representative of their nation, and then don't just take their word for it. Actually, talk to other community members, make sure that you can fact check that. There's a lot of politics within Indigenous nations, like any other nation in the world, and it's not good journalism just to take someone's word for what they're telling you. They will not speak on highly sensitive cases until they have established a relationship with you often, reputable spokespeople for communities. So if someone is just starting to unload on you all of this information, I would question the credibility of that source and really encourage you that it may be very good information, but you definitely will need to fact check that information. I think a credible Indigenous spokesperson will work to build relationship with you first, as opposed to just starting to tell you all of the inner workings of a nation. You guys pulled out some really great stories from the survey and recommendations of things that you felt were good representations of Indigenous issues in the media. One of them was Telling Indigenous Stories by Tristan Antone. He's actually a Neiman Fellow this year with Harvard University. This is his Twitter account. And so it's mentioned a few times how social media can really help you to do your outreach and to start to understand Indigenous issues and reputable voices within the media for Indigenous issues. Tristan is one of them, and we have highlighted some others. Julian Neuscat, who is going to be on the Institute with you, might even be on the webinar right now, I can't see, but he is fantastic, as well as Mark Johann, Leonard Monkman. I pull out Leonard and Julian because they're also both serving as CBC Indigenous Fellows right now and doing great series work on a variety of Indigenous issues. Leonard just recently wrote about a water gathering in Western Canada, and Julian just came back from the canoe journeys on the coast. And so highly encourage you to touch base with them or to follow them. Simon Moya Smith, he's a NBC reporter, MTV, Denver Post. He does so many, wonderful news reports. He's great to follow. Terry Hansen and Charlie Etzedy are great. Duncan McHugh, Serene Fox, Wabagesh Grace, all really great people. I was asked at the past institute how do I get my news? These are people who I find to be really reputable as voices on Indigenous issues. And this is not an exclusive list. This is some of them. And so I wanted to point you in the right direction. There's also some great Indigenous news outlets like Indian Country Today, Native News Online, CBC Indigenous, obviously an extension of CBC News for Canada, but there's so many more, and APTN, there's just so many more. So I encourage you to kind of go out and do some searching to find, ask yourself how many people on your Twitter are actually Indigenous journalists, and how can you start to uplift Indigenous journalists and Indigenous media in your network. So to engage Indigenous nations, dig deeper. Stories that don't provide context do harm. Be mindful of your own biases. Sometimes sources will be able to hear this in your questions and in the tone of your voice. And are you including Indigenous people as problem solvers in your story, not just the subject? So some learning moments from you guys that I thought were really great. First is just, there isn't one particular learning moment that stands out for me, but asking friends or colleagues who are Indigenous or people of color to read my work before I turn it into an editor has been hugely helpful. And you guys mentioned that in some of your questions today. And I just think that that's great. I think, it can never hurt to have another set of eyes on the work that you're doing. Someone also mentioned that I get very nervous writing about First Nations issues, and that's okay. I'm sure many people do, and I think we even do, writing about ourselves, as Jess mentioned, because we have so many responsibilities and people who, if we don't write correctly and if we don't speak correctly for an interview, we're going to hear about it because we're from really connected communities. And yeah, there are ways that you can slip up and unintentionally offend. But I think what Jess spoke to is come humbly, be humble, and I think as Indigenous nations we're very forgiving in lots of ways. And I know that there are journalists that have done some really horrible stories, but have been humble in that process and have worked through it to really become very reputable journalists with nations. Another person said that's a mistake I see in some journalism, assuming a leader speaks for everyone. And they have a great recount from a specific experience with Navajo Nation. And we mentioned, Jess mentioned this experience. I have it in my community. Just really make sure that you're getting with the right spokespeople. Before meeting with leaders of the Onondaga tribe, I spoke with a journalist who was working on a documentary about the Onondaga lacrosse team. She took me through the ways in which journalism can be a form of exploitation for Indigenous people, another way of perpetuating racist stereotypes. And what I really liked about this comment is that this person, really highlighted that sometimes to be able to connect with communities, you need a conduit. And that could be an Indigenous or non-Indigenous conduit, someone who's already worked with the community to kind of give you that entree. And then someone else said that we learned the importance of coming to the project with an open mind and a willingness to listen and learn. That's so important. And lastly, I pulled out this one. I think the main thing that I've learned when it comes to telling stories about Indigenous people and issues is the need for the journalist to go the extra mile, be extra careful, extra sensitive, and extra persistent. And I feel like that's a good summation of lessons learned and how to continue to learn on this journey that you guys will have in working with Indigenous nations. So some final thoughts. We really encourage you to engage with Indigenous nations in your local community and then expand from there. We are nations, not stakeholders or public interest groups. Let us speak for ourselves, and to be able to do that properly means, again, having that level of attention to detail and accuracy when quoting us, when listing titles, etc. Respect for our rights to water, territory, self-determination, understanding the legal landscape that we have to navigate as well. And that traditional territories and responsibility for stewardship must be recognized, that, that those roles that we hold dear and sacred, and really understanding free, prior, and informed consent, and why it's enshrined within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and why it's so critical to our survival and the protection of our future generations. So I know that there are probably some maybe remaining questions. I turn it maybe to Adam to tell us if we have time for them, or if there's potential to do a follow-up.
Yeah, so first of all, just thank you both so much for talking with us today. And thank you to all of our fellows who joined in and were able to participate in this. We wanted to just underscore that this is just the beginning of a conversation on reporting on and in Indigenous communities. We'll obviously be talking about a lot of this throughout our trip, but we also wanted to keep a date open for a potential follow-up where we could bring Kelsey and Jess back to field any other questions you have as you prepare for the trip. And we've identified Thursday, September 7th as a day when they both have availability. So I'm not sure how that would work with other people's schedules, but I will send out an email about that soon. I will also make sure to get Kelsey's slides for this presentation, and we have recorded this presentation so we can let folks who weren't able to tune in listen in. So I don't know if Jess or Kelsey, you have any last thing to say. No new questions have come in on the chat here, and we need to let people go. But I guess I would just say stay tuned. Thank you very much again. The silence you hear is everyone clapping at their computer monitors with their muted microphones.
Hey, Adam.
Yeah, and then I guess we'll turn it over to Dave for the final part here.
Well, I want to echo what Adam said, that if we were all in a room together, the applause would be deafening. I mean, that was really amazing, and I really appreciate you guys taking all this time to put this together, and it was really great. And I just want to say too, before we go, thanks a lot to Megan and Jenny and the Moore Foundation for making this happen, and everything that's coming in the next several weeks. And we'll see you all in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to Dave and Adam. I think that, our final thoughts, at least on my end, were mine. I'll definitely let Jess say her thank yous. But that's my email, leonardk@mcmaster.ca, and that's also my Twitter handle. I did the same extension of an offer to the past journalists for the past institutes. You are welcome to email me with questions, to follow me, to direct message me on Twitter or add comments. I'm happy to be of assistance and a resource where I can, or at least point you in the right direction. And so it's really been an honor and a privilege to be able to share with you today.
I would just add, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with all of you and to learn with you once you're here on the ground. I wish that more journalists took the time to do the kind of deep learning that you're engaging in. So thank you for making a point of doing that, and thank you, Dave and Adam and everyone at Moore, and all the people who are mobilizing to make this a real opportunity, because I think it is incredibly important work. So thank you.
All right. Well, once again, everyone, a final thanks. Stay tuned. More information will be coming shortly, including a list of things you might want to pack. So look in your inboxes early next week, and we will start the deluge of last-minute information that you need to get to Vancouver and get out in the field with us. So again, thanks, Jess and Kelsey. I'll see if we want to reschedule a follow-up with both of you where people can bounce questions off you, and we will wrap it up. And tell them how to hang up at the end. I'm not quite sure. I think just go to GoToMeeting and quit it. That's what I'm going to do. All right, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we will be in touch. And Kelsey and Jess, again, thank you so much.